Hello, and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. Today's episode is a little different, and I won't be interviewing an author today. Instead, I'm joined by two book lovers, book bloggers, and activists to talk about some really important issues. I'll have with me today Ola Abou and Ilham Essalih. At the time of recording, we are on day 9 of Israel's war against Gaza, with the official death toll having reached nearly 3,000 people, 700 of whom are children and babies. For 9 days, the besieged Gaza Strip has faced relentless attacks and a total land, sea, and air blockade, cutting off its supplies of water, food, and fuel to 2.3 million people. The situation is beyond horrendous, as hospitals struggle to cope with the injured amid a lack of medical supplies, fuel, and doctors, and communities are being ordered to leave their homes due to imminent threat. Even while leaving, passages that were previously declared safe have been attacked, sparing no one. There are also increasing reports on attacks in the occupied West Bank and arrests of over 70 people. Unfortunately, Palestine is not the only place impacted by Israel. Israel has been bombing Syria, which since 2011 has been in a devastating state of war and crisis. 12 years after protesters in Syria first demonstrated and rose up against the 4-decade rule of the Assad family, hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been killed and nearly 13 million people, more than half the country's pre-war population, has been displaced. Amid the war, the Syrian people are suffering an economic crisis, and a massive earthquake at the start of this year, 2023, cast much of the population in the north into even further despair. For today's episode, I'm joined by Ola and Ilham to talk about these crises and what we should be reading, thinking about, and doing. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ilham and Ola. I know this is a particularly difficult time. So before we begin, I just want to check in. How are you doing? Let's start with you, Ola.
Thank you so much, Samia. It hasn't been easy on any of us, to be frank, since the beginning of the Israeli bombardment on Gaza. Yesterday, I have been to a demonstration in Amsterdam, and I was pleasantly surprised to see the number of people who showed up in support. And I have to admit that did lift up my spirit. I do feel a little that I sensed more solidarity yesterday than I have had ever when it comes to the Palestinian cause here in Europe. But going back to just seeing the numbers and seeing the footage and also reading the news, you feel a sense of helplessness, and that's kind of an ongoing state. But yeah, there's always hope, so inshallah.
Ola, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think so many of your feelings and your experiences will be shared by so many at the moment. Ilham, how are you?
Hi, Samia. Thank you so much for having me. I think obviously we're all doing pretty much the same. We're physically fine, we're safe, we're very lucky. But, mentally it's very hard it's a very hard thing to witness. The feeling of helplessness and of betrayal as well, of anger, sadness. It's just a lot of emotions at the same time. And I think what Ola is saying is really, really interesting, because when you're faced with all this news and all these images and all the death, it just makes you despair a lot. And then, but then for me, as the only thing that gives me hope, if there is even, any hope, is to see actual Palestinians and how they face these times. But also, like Ola said, I think being surrounded with people is a great thing to do right now. I think the worst thing you can do is, be on your phone like 24/7 and watch the news and just process it by yourself. I think processing it by yourself is a bit dangerous for your mental health. So I think it's really important to be surrounded with people and to talk about this as well, even with your loved ones. I find it very helpful to actually talk to people about it. So yeah, that's my feeling.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is so much strength in like community and also just like shared grief and confusion and anger. I think there's a lot that we can take from that, but also like you said, like hearing from people in Palestine, both from the perspective of understanding what's going on, but also seeing some of that, how they are getting from moment to moment, and that kind of like, you know, that resilience, but also some of the questions that they most rightly have. Before we kind of get into what we're here to talk about today, I was hoping that you guys could just briefly introduce yourself, because I haven't done a formal introduction. So Ilham, maybe we can start with you. Just tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yes, so I'm Ilham, obviously. I'm actually a PhD candidate in comparative literature at the University of London. I'm currently working on writing my thesis. I'm in my last year before my submission deadline, hopefully. Looking forward to finishing, hopefully. So my research focuses on literatures from the MENA region. My actual thesis topic is the Sudanese writer Tayyip Saleh. I don't really talk about this much on my platforms. I'm not sure why. I don't know. It's very personal. But I also have a very particular interest in Palestinian literature, but also like Zionist literature. Like I've never admitted this. I've never talked about this on my platforms, but I'm really fascinated by Zionist literature. I find it very important. I'll get to it later, but I find it very important to actually engage with that discourse. So I'm also a bookstagrammer like you guys. I mainly post book reviews about these topics and books coming from these regions.
Thank you, Ilham. That, I mean, I feel like I just learned so much about you that I didn't even know. So thank you so much for that. And Ola, please introduce yourself.
My name is Ola. I am Syrian, and I'm living in the Netherlands. I'm I'm a student as well, but not nearly as far or smart as Ilham, obviously. I'm a master's student, so I'm not doing a PhD. Alhamdulillah.
Please don't.
I don't think they'll allow me anyway.
Oh,
but I'm doing a master's in data science and artificial intelligence. Also, just like Ilham, in the phase of preparing for my thesis, but I haven't even picked a topic. So I am mostly reading research and trying to pick a topic still. I work as a data scientist for a company here in the Netherlands, and I'm a bookstagrammer just like you guys. Not very active, sadly, but I try my best. And I mostly like to read. Currently this year I've been reading a lot of nonfiction, but I like to read fiction from all over the world. I don't really have a specific theme, and I host the slow reading book club here in the Netherlands regularly. Not every, you can say bi-monthly, I guess.
Thank you, Ola, for that. Also, learning more things about you as well. This is brilliant. I love it. But obviously, we're here today because, you know, I just wanted to create the space for us to talk a little bit about some of the literature that we can and should be reading around both Palestine and Syria, but also looking at the issues, I think, in a little bit more depth. And I think just to kick things off, social media is a really interesting place, I think, all of the time. But it is also a really interesting place when it comes to how people talk about war and crises generally, but in particular with the Middle East. And I would say even more particularly with regards to the Palestine issue. Now, why do you think that people are so kind of like reluctant on some level to talk about the issue? And I think one of the things that people keep on saying is like, oh, you know, it's a very complex issue. Now, in your opinion and your experiences, where do you think this comes from? Ilham, let's start with you.
Okay, so I would say two main reasons. First of all, I think because the reason it's so complex and people are, you know, lost in between two different sides, so to speak, is that there's a very intense Zionist propaganda machine that works really, really, really hard to rewrite the course of history and present, you know, these so-called like historical facts as truth. And second reason for this reluctance, I think, is because the question of you know, Jewish sovereignty and Jewish, you know, atrocities that have happened in the past have made it a very sensitive topic, and understandably so, I think. So I think the rewriting of history, and specifically the Jewish question, is why it's so complex.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned that the sort of the Zionist agenda to tell a particular history. I think there's something very kind of important to address there as well, is sort of like almost like the economic backing and the positions around the world that these particular storytellers or historians, whatever it may be, have in which to get their narrative across. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is that not only is this like a particular side, but it's becoming the mainstream. And I think that's where there's a lot we should be concerned about. Ola, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I agree definitely with Ilham's point, and also what you mentioned about the economical aspect of the strength that we're facing is not to be underestimated, I guess. And also understanding that at least here in Europe, I can say that there are sometimes massive consequences for supporting the Palestinian cause. And of course, this is not me saying that it's a good excuse or it's an excuse, but we also have to remember that what people and activists here are faced with. My friend Wafa Mustafa shared just very few videos from the brutality of German police against peaceful pro-Palestine protesters from yesterday's protest in Berlin. And that's just like, in Arabic you say غيض من فيض, which is just, I don't know how to translate it, like it's a drop in the ocean, because people are using their academic positions. Some companies would go as far as fire their employees for showing support for the Palestinian cause for liberation. So we really need to understand the severity of this propaganda and the effect that it has on, honestly, just normal civilians who want to support the cause, because pro-Palestine activists not all of them have resources to fight this back. So yeah,
I think that's a really important point that you've brought up, and something that maybe we don't think about often enough. And actually, just this morning, there's been really devastating news come out from America of a young boy being killed just because of an assumed affiliation with Palestine, which I think is slightly different to the point that you were making, Ola, but just shows how polarized society is becoming and how dangerous it is to be a Palestinian or to be somebody who is affiliated to the cause around the world. It's just absolutely horrific. Like there are no words, really. But I just want to touch briefly also move on a little bit with regards to what we want to talk about today. So, we are talking about what the situation is in Palestine, but also we're looking at Syria. And Ola, I want to hand over here to you a little bit now. And I think what we don't see enough about is thinking about what is happening in Syria in relation to what's happening in Palestine, and that sort of intersectionality and the almost like the joining of the two movements. And I wondered if you could just take a moment to reflect on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm really glad. I was actually very happy when you reached out and you said you would like to talk about that, because I think it's a very important discussion to be had in spaces. And so, from a historical perspective, if you understand Palestinian strife for freedom and liberation, and also the Syrian suffering under Assad regime, and if you think about it historically and how these two causes have come to be what they are today, and the consequences that occupation and dictatorship have had on both people, you can see that the two movements are, and the two struggles are not only intersectional, but I would even say intertwined with each other. In order to understand that, we have to understand how coloniality made space for dictatorships, just the same way it did for occupation. By coloniality, I mean be it the British mandate in Palestine or the French in Syria. Another thing that I think we have to understand is that occupiers, they need to be surrounded by dictators. And that's exactly the case that you have in the Middle East, because dictators keep their communities very weak. And you have to remember that every occupier wants to expand. So it's not like Israel only wants to have Palestinian land. No, they do have hopes and dreams of expanding beyond that. And having a dictatorial neighborhood, or a neighboring country makes this expansion a lot easier to achieve. It's also important to remember how dictators, for example, I think most of the time I will be referring to Bashar al-Assad, the current dictator ruling in Syria, have never considered Palestinian refugees within their lands. So we have to think about the Yarmouk camp massacre in Syria and the siege of the camp that was mainly a Palestinian camp in Syria, and how they had little respect for Palestinians. Well, actually, no respect to Palestinians, but also no, like Palestinians were not treated different than Syrians, and they were just as oppressed, and they still are just as oppressed, be it in detention centers, be it when they were bombed in their in the areas where they live, like I was mentioning the camp, but also that and this is kind of painful for me to talk about, because I feel like every time I have to talk about why Bashar al-Assad is an evil when it comes to Palestinian cause, I have to bring out that he was bad towards Palestinian, because people are more like, oh, but he was just bad towards Syrians, as if that's okay. And I faced a lot of these very racist reactions when it comes to a lot of anti-imperialist activists that are actually pro-Assad, that but they he's only killing Syrians, he's only killing Syrians, which is not true. But even if it was true, it's an it's outrageous argument, to say the least. But we also another thing that we need to consider is that dictators are willing to give their land to occupiers in return of some specific favor. People often forget that Hafiz al-Assad, who was the Assad the father, back when he was a defense minister, he ordered troops to withdraw from the Golan Heights so that the Israelis could take over. So we have to understand that dictators are all the time, not most of the time, complicit with occupiers. And I think that if we start from understanding these fundamental points, you can understand how the Palestinian and the Syrian movements for freedom are intertwined.
There was so much in what you just said, Ola. I think a real education, I think, for anyone listening, and for myself included. And I think really important also in how we perceive and what we think about when we think also of the Palestinian freedom movement and the sort of like the activists and the allies in the West in particular, and the approaches that they have. I think it's very easy to look at the suffering in Palestine and simply focus on a person's viewpoint on Palestine, disregarding what they may think of or what they may believe and where they may stand when it comes to other issues, Syria included. But I think it's really important, as you've said so eloquently and really deeply as well, is that the movements are so intertwined. To have a harmful view on one definitely impacts, I think, as well, sort of like the legitimacy of their view on the other, and that we can have a movement or a position where we support both and one is not compromised by the other. So thank you so much. And I would like to sort of take this conversation forward now to literature, because I'm always of the view that reading around an issue can only be a good thing. And sometimes it feels like a very privileged position because, we're sat in like our warm homes and our safe libraries and where we have access to books. And I think actually sometimes using your privilege is the only thing that you can do and is the thing that you should be doing. And so, I'd just like to sort of come now and talk about some of the books that we can be reading to understand both what is going on in Palestine and Syria and how we can use that to really fuel our activism, but also sort of like our personal understanding of the situation. So Ilham, let's begin with you. What are some of the books that you have read or that you recommend with regards to the situation in Palestine?
Okay, so before I answer you, I'm sorry, I just want to say something about what Ola just said. I just want to thank Ola so much for what she just, explained. I think that was incredibly insightful, very, very helpful in also like understanding so many things. Like while you were talking, Ola, I just had in my mind, I was like making all these connections and thinking like, oh wow, this makes so much sense. Even when, we read literature and we when we have these conversations about which writers to support and which writers are, so to speak, do we want to recommend when it comes to the Palestinian cause. So I think that makes a lot of sense, so thank you. Maybe we can talk about this a bit later. But to answer your question, Samia, I think it's really important to do two different things when you want to learn about the Palestine question and when you want to read about it. First of all, I think you need to focus on Palestinian voices. And then second, I think you really need to focus on trying to understand the Zionist discourse. I think you can't do one without the other. Reading Palestinian voices and Palestinian history and Palestinian stories is amazing because it helps to have these actual stories and know them and know the people, know the atrocities. But I think it's not enough. I think you need to supplement that with learning about how Zionism came about, the history of it, how it works, the discourse that it uses. I think you absolutely need to do that because otherwise I think I'm convinced you can't defend the Palestinian cause without actually knowing the Zionist cause deeply, because it doesn't make sense. It only, everything makes sense once you know both, not both, I don't want to say both sides, but it only makes sense when you understand, Israel, and so when it comes to understanding Palestine, I think we all more or less have the same, references. We all, most Palestinian writers are known. They're famous. They're amazing. I'm thinking of, Ghassan Kanafani. I'm thinking of Emil Habibi. He's a lot less known, but his novel, The Secret Life of Saeed, the Peace Optimist, is an amazing classic. There is, the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. We have all the writings by Edward Said. He wrote so many essays on Palestine. And then he also wrote a memoir called Out of Place, which is very important too. And then Murid Barghouti's memoir, I Saw Ramallah. That one is so touching and amazing and so insightful, and you learn so much as well. And then when it comes to I think, contemporary literature is also very helpful for us, for our readers right now, because it's easier for you to relate to, present voices. I'm thinking of Isabella Hamad. Isabella Hamad is a British Palestinian writer. I've only read her novel, The Parisian. That novel was a novel I really, really enjoyed, and I think it's a very slow and long novel. I think Ola read it as well, and she loved it too. And it's quite a read, but it's very, very helpful to understanding, I think, Arab sentiment and Palestinian sentiment pre-Nakba. And then there's a writer called Ahlam Psharat. She writes for young adults. There's a novel that she wrote called Trees for the Absentees. And then there's one, I can't remember the exact title. It's something Code Butterfly or something. Correct me if you know the right title. And then we've got Adania Shibli, who wrote Minor Detail. She was on the news the past days because she was supposed to be awarded an award at Frankfurt Literature Festival or something, and it was cancelled because of her novel, which is basically about the rape and killing of a young Palestinian woman by Israeli soldiers. And then what else can I recommend? I think Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, is a great piece of nonfiction. Oh yes, and then of course there's a lot of poetry out there. I'm thinking of Muhammad al-Kurd's Rifqa, because that one was is very recent, and it's very, very relevant right now, because it was literally written like, you know, in the past years, so it's extremely relevant. So that's it for me for the Palestinian side. And then when it comes to the, you know, understanding the Zionists and the anti-Zionism and the history of Israel, I think I can think of two main scholars, Ilan Pappé and Avi Shlaim. They're both from the generation of new historians, Israeli new historians. They basically dedicate their work, their research to you know, debunking Israel's rewriting of history, and they're historians, so their work is extremely you know, scholarly and reliable. I'm thinking of Ilan Pappé's 10 Myths About Israel. I talk about this book all the time because it's a very easy read. It's very accessible. It's very digestible, and it's currently free on the Verso Books website. You can download the ebook version for free. And then the other writer is Avi Shlaim. He's an Iraqi Jewish Israeli historian, and I recently read his memoir called Three Worlds. In it, he, you know, kind of wants to set the record straight about the different histories of Jews who are from Arab lands, because there's a lot of myths about how the Arabs were expelled from the Arab lands, how they were, you know, driven out because of Arab anti-Semitism, and he explains in very much detail his family's history growing up in Baghdad, among a very happy family. He's explaining, were very wealthy, very influential, very much integrated into Baghdad society. And then the creation of Israel, and then later the 1967 war came to destroy any hope for them to continue living in their country. That book is extremely eye-opening because it is, like I said, it debunks all of these myths about these Arab Jews, and also he gives you know, a history of Zionism and how this you know, the concept and the project of Zionism was perceived by these Arab Jews. It's very, very insightful, very interesting. And he also wrote, I think he wrote his PhD thesis on Palestine as well, and on Zionism. And he has written countless books about the question too. Yes, and then when it comes to like actual Zionist works, I don't want to mention any like specific titles because that's not really the point of why I'm here. But you can find so many like very famous Israeli classics, and in these texts you find there's always this very strong like colonialist dimension to them. I've read memoirs by such writers, and their depiction of Palestinians is always very dehumanizing, and also the way that they write about Palestinians is very interesting because they always write about them as these foreigners, as the Arab foreigners who are just very stubborn to stay in our lands, and they don't want to just leave and go to just the other Arab lands. And then they'll say, you know, their rhetoric is, you know, why can't we just have one Jewish country where we are safe, when Arabs, they basically say themselves that they're all Arabs anyway, so why don't they just move to other Arab countries? You know, why are they so obstinate about being here in our Jewish land and kill and wanting to kill us? Because that's also part of, you know, their rhetoric. Every single Palestinian wants our death, and we need to get rid of them, whether it is by expelling them or making them leave or by killing them. Because for the Zionist project, every Palestinian life is a threat because it threatens the integrity of the Zionist project. So yeah, that's what I found in common in all of these Israeli stories or all of these Zionist stories, is that they will either never mention Palestinians as if they absolutely don't exist, or you will find them depicted, like I said, as terrorists or as foreigners, which is so interesting that they're depicted as foreigners. It's just so mind-blowing, I find.
Ilham, thank you. I mean, you have given us like a library of books that people can read, and honestly, like, there is no excuse to not inform yourself and not find out what is happening, if you know, because there is so much literature out there. And I will put all of the details of all the books mentioned in today's episode in the show notes, so you know it's really accessible for anyone listening today as well. I mean, I'm really interested in your interest in engaging with actual Zionist literature, because I think the one side of Zionist literature is having a look at people who have a connection to Israel and understand the Zionist agenda and Zionist thinking and are writing to counteract that. So that's where kind of the writing of Ilan Pappé comes in, I suppose. But you actually engage with actual Zionist literature, like you read it, and it sounds bizarre, to be honest. And I think you mentioned this sort of use of the word foreigners in relation to Palestine, which is actually comical because this is their land. But I just wonder what your experiences of that are, kind of on like a personal level. Like, how do you feel when you read when you've read some of the things that you have read that are actually that is actual Zionist literature, and also like, how do you think that has impacted how you're then able to relate to kind of the media or anything coming out with a very heavy Zionist agenda?
So I just want to make a little disclaimer before I delve into this topic. I personally engage with Zionist discourse and Zionist literature because it's a research interest of mine. I do a lot of research in these topics, and I think it's important for me to do it as a researcher, as an academic researcher. I don't promote these texts or these literatures on my platforms because that's not really what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to make people read these. I would never keep people from reading anything, but I think it's also a moral responsibility to make sure that we are aware of what we promote, especially when it comes to boycotting Israeli institutions and Israeli scholars. So take this not as a recommendation to read Zionist fiction or Zionist memoirs, just as a finding of my some findings that I have come to over the years. First of all, you say it's very comical that they are depicted as foreigners. It's comical to you and it's comical to us, but it makes absolute sense to them. It makes 100% sense because it's part of their perception of the world. It is 100% part of the perception of the world. And what I found very, very scary, having read all of this literature, and also I'm also always interested in content, like social media content by Jewish creators or Zionist creators or Israeli creators. Not that they're the same thing. I don't want to conflate all of these. So much so that my Instagram algorithm actually thinks I'm a Zionist, and I always get recommended reels about very, very Zionist reels. I always get pushed that kind of content. But one thing I would say is that it is very, very easy, so easy to be convinced by their message, because their message in their words makes absolute sense. It makes absolute sense. So my experience has been very, very frustrating. It's extremely difficult and frustrating to read this kind of literature because the pain that is behind it. You understand every single unsaid thing. You know what it means. when they don't, when they mention a specific city, Israeli city, or that Israeli city was built on top of an ethnically cleansed Palestinian village. That there's so many untold stories of Palestinians, right? It's just right in front of you. But so I read this one memoir by this Israeli writer, and I had read it because she wrote about how she left Israel because she didn't believe in Israel anymore. I thought, oh, this is going to be a great read, but it turns out she didn't like Israel anymore because she is a Jew of Yemeni descent, and she found that the Israeli project was not really meant for her as a Yemeni Jew. It was meant more for, to give all the chances to the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the Jews who come from Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And she found that, for instance, joining the army, joining the IDF, she found that she wasn't given a fair chance because she was a brown person of Arab descent, and she said something so crazy that was so crazy to me. And she was saying that because I am of Yemeni descent and because they are racist towards us, I can't get to be an IDF pilot. Instead, I have to be an IDF secretary. It's like, it's just so crazy. And the more I read it, the more I could feel, it was very palpable to me that she was talking about being scared of being in Israel, being constantly threatened by like terrorist attacks by Palestinians. And it was just crazy to me that the Palestinian side of the story is just completely muted. It doesn't exist. And it reminded me of something that Edward Said said about Palestinians, about how Palestinians are always not silenced, it's not the right word, but their story is always, removed from reality, sort of, it's just never mentioned. And it's so much the case in Israeli literature. Like, we know that, Palestinians exist, but they don't exist in their world,
Yeah, I mean, there have been, like, in fairly modern day, actual Israeli, like, leaders and politicians that have said things like, there is no such thing as a Palestinian. Like, there's millions of Palestinians. So,
So the discourse around Palestinians is that they are Arab people. And because of Pan-Arabism, it was very easy to convince people that these were all just Arabs, and Arabs all come from Saudi Arabia. And so they should all just go back to Saudi Arabia. That's how they view Palestinians, because for them, Arabs don't originate in the Holy Land, which is true, but what they fail to see is that Palestinians are just indigenous people who became Arabized and Islamized, and many Palestinians probably have ancestors who were Jewish or Christian before and who became Muslim at some point in history or became Arabized. And so to them, Palestinians are just this annoying presence that they need to get rid of because it just doesn't make sense to them that like I have read Zionist discourse that says that the creation of Israel and the success of Israel is it can be analyzed as it can be interpreted as the first successful decolonization movement. For them, creating Israel is a decolonization movement because they were the first indigenous people who actually returned to their land and expelled the conquerors. They view Palestinians as some foreign Arab conquerors who came and oppressed the local Jewish population. And so now they have to you have to get rid of them.
It's really fascinating, everything you've just spoken about, Ilham. And Ola, actually, I want to bring you into the conversation. I wondered if you want to just add anything or reflect on anything that we've just been talking about now.
That it's very fascinating to listen to Ilham because, I trust Ilham is a very knowledgeable person when it comes to the history of Zionism and also obviously the history of the Palestinian movement for liberation. And it's interesting because, and that's that's something that we've also been seeing a lot on people on social media. like with the rise of social media activism, that a lot of it sadly is not fact checked. And that is why it's very important to engage with these narratives, as as Ilham, sorry, was mentioning before, because um, you have to. I think there was a hadith by the Prophet. I don't know if I remember if it's sahih or not, but it had something to do about how you have to learn the languages and the culture, and understand the other in order to be able to, be it an enemy or be it a friend or be it, an ally, in order to understand them and engage with them. So I've seen a lot of, I'm not going to mention, specific types of content or content creators, obviously not, but I've seen a lot of content about how, no, it's a lie. This land has always been Muslim, which is, historically speaking, that's just,
it's not true.
yeah, because it's, even if you think about the Abrahamic religions, Islam is the newest religion, so it's not really, like, it doesn't make any sense to say that Palestine has always, and it also cancels out the Christianity in Palestine, and it affects Arab Jews in a negative way as well. Arab Jews who also live in Arab countries. I mean, there are very few of them. I think there are very few in Syria left, in Damascus, probably like very few families, but still, it's not a healthy contextualization, because simply it's not true. So it's very interesting to listen to this and to kind of, I guess, like, connect the dots. So
yeah. And this kind of discourse, it just stems from not knowing, and not informing yourself about these histories, which are, and it's very easy to learn about these things, like everything is so readily available. And also I do think it's important to know about this stuff, because it helps you to humanize the other as well.
Yeah,
because what we're seeing right now is we see so many people demonizing others. They will demonize, they will do, and they will fall into, like, very clear anti-Semitism as well. We see it sometimes we see it, but I think reading about this, about the other side, so to speak, helps to rehumanize them and to understand their struggle. And I think my main takeaway is that Zionism was created for a persecuted people who were, the victims of terrible atrocities across Europe. But what, European colonialism did was just transfer, or like get rid of their, of their Jewish question, so to speak, and just transfer it to the Arab world, which is something that Edward Said said as well, that Europe didn't know what to do with its own anti-Semitism, basically, and had to just transfer the problem elsewhere.
I think this is a notorious problem that the West has in general, how to deal with their own problems. And they have a track record of trying to just lump it on somebody else without thinking about the consequences, which we have seen historically have been severe, and we are dealing with them still today. So it doesn't. I mean, I think that is absolutely true. And Ola, I want to also, we've just had this really great kind of conversation, insight onto literature around Palestine, and what's become apparent, I think, to me over time is that there is no shortage of books, no matter what position you're coming at, whether you're someone that knows literally nothing for whatever reason, and whether you're somebody that already has a ton of knowledge, or you're an academic, or whatever it may be, whether you're someone that likes poetry or fiction or nonfiction. And I think actually the same goes for Syria. I think there is a lot of literature. And Ola, I want to hand over to you to talk about some of the literature available around Syria and finding out what's going on.
Yes, thanks, Samia. But before we go on, I wanna make a quick comment on what we have just discussed, because it's really fascinating to me. I always learn from Ilham. I don't know if probably Samia. I don't think people know, we're like very close friends. So we talk about these things on. We always text about, really deep political discourse all the time. Every time I talk to her, I'm like, aha, okay, this is eye-opening. But this, the discussion that we've just had about the anti-Semitism problem of Europe, Very recently I was listening to this podcast, the rest is history. I don't remember which episode it was, but they were talking about the racism that people in the UK had towards Jewish refugees who came from Europe after the World War, or during. And what was fascinating to me is how similar the narrative is to Muslim refugees here. I myself came to this country first as a refugee, so I know I've experienced it firsthand, a lot of Islamophobia. And yeah, maybe, I mean, living in the Netherlands doesn't compare to living in Germany or in more,
Yeah.
I don't want to label, but some countries are a bit more tolerant than others. I don't want to be mean, but you guys get the gist of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But the narrative is really, really similar. Like, they're taking our jobs, they're taking, I mean, back then it was more businesses. The Jews are taking our businesses, they're like changing, the country's changing, we can't recognize our Christian countries anymore. And it's the exact same thing, but now it's transferred to the Muslims, because majority of
Yeah.
refugees are Muslims. But
Yes, it's a Europe problem.
yeah, exactly. So back to your question, Samia, about Syrian authors. I made categories, so that makes it easy for me to talk about. I will start with fiction. Recently, we have all been, honestly, all Syrians specifically devastated by the news of the passing of Khalid Khalife, who was not only an amazing author, but also a wonderful human being and an activist, and someone who always stood up for what's right and who always spoke his truth. And there's a fascinating documentary of him, because he did stay in Syria. He did not want to leave the country. Where so in the documentary he talks. It's a very short video. He talks about life there and how it has become. And he is someone, the first thing that you notice is that how he is so over himself. He doesn't take himself seriously. He doesn't pretend like he's gonna save the world by writing, which I know is ironic because books have a great impact on education, but it's nice to also put things in perspective, that you know resistance and activism is definitely not only reading and writing. And yeah, it was wonderful to watch him. But yeah, sadly we have lost him too early. He has some recent work that I still have not read, but I can recommend his classic In Praise of Hatred, that we have actually read for one book club session. And it talks about basically the rise of Muslim brotherhood in Syria back in the 80s, and how their movement was crushed with violence from Assad regime. But when I say here Assad regime, it's the father, not the son. And it's absolutely fascinating to see how much he humanizes the characters. There were some issues in the way that he writes about women, I have to admit, but the way that he talks about hatred and the sources of hatred, and how it seeps into people from any side and in any way, and be it occupier and among different sects and different beliefs. It's a wonderful work that I can recommend. There are also other Syrian authors like Samar Yazbek, Zakaria Tamer, who have also written extensively. They have a lot of literature about Syria. But one in particular I want to talk about, it's not actually by a Syrian author, it's by a Canadian author from Egyptian descent. I think he's Canadian, Omar Laqad, and that is What Strange Paradise. He talks about the basically the story of a Syrian boy who becomes a refugee and his trip through the sea. And it's a wonderful book, but it's very painful to read. But what I like about that book is that Omar Laqad is very aware of the context. And there are so many non-Syrian, even Syrian authors actually, that have written about Syrians or about refugees, where you can tell that they're using the refugee storyline as a tool or as a literary device to just drive the plot in ways that are not meaningful or that are honestly insensitive, but you can tell that Omar Laqad is very considerate in his writing. And I think his journalist background, I do believe he's a journalist as well, you can tell that he has done a lot of research and he understands the complexity of the situation. So he doesn't oversimplify it, but he still presents it in a way that is very digestible for readers. So that's it for the fiction. For nonfiction, I also have some subcategories here. So since we've we've already been talking about also books by Palestinian authors, the next book is co-written by a Palestinian activist. So this is in a category of where to start in understanding the narrative surrounding the Middle East. I would highly recommend The Middle East Crisis Factory by Iyad al-Baghdadi and Ahmed Qatnash. Iyad al-Baghdadi is a Palestinian activist who lived in the United Arab Emirates, and then I think he was detained because of his activism during the Arab Spring, and he had to flee to Norway. And Ahmed Qatnash is also a British activist of Libyan descent. So they both have they have extensive experiences and research. They have both conducted a lot of research when it comes to conflicts in the Middle East. And I think it's a wonderful place to start because it takes into consideration, as we were saying, the intersectionality, but also the intertwinement. I don't know if that's a word. I think it is, between colonialism, terrorism, and dictatorship. And it's a very I'm choosing this as a place to start because it's very easy to read. This book, it's very digestible. The way that it is structured makes it makes it very clear to read it beginning to end. The way that it's designed in a way that makes it easy to move from one section to the other. I genuinely never thought I would have said that, but this is the number one page turner I've ever read, and it's a political nonfiction. I never thought that would be it, but it's really this is the the OG page turner, I would say. Now for a different category, I can for if you want to read more analysis about Syria, also about Palestine, I can recommend few authors who they have written abundantly on both. From a Syrian author I would like to recommend is Yassin al-Haj Saleh. He's a Syrian author and an activist himself, and he writes for a lot of newspapers. I would recommend just following him and seeing that following him on Twitter, for example, and then reading any articles that he shares, or following and reading the places where he writes, because he provides a very insightful analysis, and he writes in multiple languages. His writing is a little bit like, for me, it takes me to read it a couple times to understand it, but I think it's that's the way with when it comes to analysis. Another person, a journalist who's writing, I'd recommend is Kim Ghattas. She's, I think, a Dutch of Lebanese origin, and she also writes. She also does a lot of analysis when it comes to Syria, but also the Middle East in general. I occasionally share some of her articles. That's someone I would also recommend looking out for. If we're going to talk a bit books about the Syrian revolution, I think the most comprehensive work is Burning Country by Robin Yassin Qassab and Layla Shami, Syrians and Revolution and War. It's how do you describe this book? It tackles chronologically the Syrian revolution from it goes a little bit from like before the revolution and the oppression that Syrians have endured from the days of Assad the father, and then talks about the beginning of the revolution. It engages in discourse with a lot of Syrian activists who were working on the ground, which is something I really appreciate because they have a lot more insights than anyone can tell you, because most of a lot of media news outlets were not allowed on the ground at the beginning of the Arab Spring, and I think that's still the case. Maybe now it's a bit different depending on who you are and who you work with. But the Syrian activists that were working on the ground are, you can describe most of them as a very good source of truth regarding what was going on actually in these areas. So that's another one. When I talk about Syria, I think it's very important to understand and read about the siege. That's how many Syrian cities have fell to the Assad army and the Russian militia. The Russian and the Iranian and the Hezbollah militia, is by sieging a lot of cities and towns. One piece of work I would like to highlight is the book Collectors of Daraya by Delphine Minou. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but I'm sure, Samia, you will link the books below, right? So we can find, you can find them. And it's a book about a group of activists, Syrian activists, who start collecting books basically under the siege in Daraya. And the way they start doing it is basically finding books that were under rubbles and collecting them so people can in a safe, relatively safe place where people can reach for them and read. And you can also see how careful they were by labeling where was this book found, under the rubbles of which house, so that in case the person came back, we can give them back their book. And it's amazing to see how civil society was at work when you remove dictatorship from the equation. But that book also talks about what happened during the siege. So it doesn't only talk about the book, the library that they have, or the collection of books that they have created, but also about the events, the following events, and the fall of Daraya, and what happened to the activists and all of that. And I believe the experience is similar to a lot of Syrian cities. If you want to read more about Syrian voices, I can recommend We Crossed the Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria by Wendy Perlman. Testimonies from different Syrians. What I like about this book is that you get, basically a witness testimony from different Syrians, but they're really different. You see different ethnicities, genders, people from different backgrounds, class backgrounds, activists, non-activists. Yeah, a lot of various groups of Syrians have participated in giving their testimonies for this book. So one final book I would like to mention is not really a book from Syria, and it's not by a Syrian author, but I made a category called Activist Voices. And for this category, I think in order to understand the Middle East, but also like regarding dictatorships, but also colonization and Palestine, I would recommend You Have Not Yet Been Defeated by Ala Abdel Fattah, who's a prominent Egyptian activist. It's a collection of essays and articles by Ala, and they span from, I believe, 2010 until 2020, but I'm not 100% sure. I need to check. The best thing, I guess, about reading this book is that it's very accessible. His writing, Ala's writing, is very accessible. And as I was reading the book, it became very clear to me that this was intentional, because he is someone who believes in engagement and in engaging everybody in political discourse, not only elites and not only academics, and that's something I really appreciate and I miss a lot also when I read about academics writing on the Middle East. So yeah, that's my final recommendation.
Thank you, Ola. So many recommendations. So many recommendations. I think looking at things from so many different angles, which I feel like in the list that you've just given, there is something there for everyone who's interested in any area of the Arab Spring or Syria, what's going on right now, but like historically too. What are some of the what are some of your bugbears with some of the literature around Syria, whether it's written by somebody from Syria or somebody not? What are some of the things that have like really frustrated you over the years?
Oh, I have to think on this one. Okay. I think that it does bother me when I see people mentioning Syrian refugees in a way to add a dimension to a character that's not Syrian. So, for example, to show that that a character is very like humane and is very nice and sweet, that they volunteer to help Syrian refugees. They do that all the time. They also do that in TV shows a lot. And I do understand it,
Yeah.
like I do get that sometimes maybe that's not the intention, and maybe the author genuinely does interact with Syrian refugees on a deeper level, but I still get the ick because I've read that actually in multiple books. I think even Sami Rooney it's like, you're just a refugee and we are just interested in that, and we need to talk about that and hear about that, and it's very dehumanizing, and it's also another dehumanization. I mean, I can't say if I've seen that in books, but I'm pretty sure it exists in like movies. For example, I was very frustrated by the swimmers and the storyline around the swimmers and around the successful refugee who is like, oh, but we are stars and we are successful and we exactly. And We're not like the other ones. We're not, we
We're
can
special,
make a
yeah.
difference as if,
We're not like the other ones.
as if we were not, we're not seeking
Yeah.
safety, exactly, as if we're seeking opportunity, not safety, or as if, I don't know. And
beings, yeah.
that's also very frustrating. So yeah, these two narratives really frustrate me.
I'm reminded also of, remember when Khaled Hosseini wrote that little book about the Syrian boy
litera.
who drowned?
I don't know about that.
Like, where did that come from?
We have a lot.
It's a poem, isn't it? Like a poem.
What? It's like you don't know it, Ola? It's like a little like an illustrated book that Khalid Hosseini,
Elian, I think his name
wrote
was,
about. You know the little.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Khalid Hosseini wrote a whole book about him, but like illustrated. But it was so, to me, it feels like it's such like poor taste. I don't know. I don't want to say it's not your story to tell, because I don't really believe in that anymore. I used to believe in that, but I don't anymore. But I don't know. It reminds me of people now who are just constantly, like bombarding us with Palestine content, when I don't, like you said, I don't want to question people's intentions, but it doesn't feel as sincere sometimes.
Of the Bush family, right? I mean,
Ola, I found it really interesting. Your reflections on the swimmers and this sort of like the good refugee narrative, and I think one of the things that really gets to me about that is that it's almost as if we're saying, like, oh well, of course we should welcome these refugees because, well, look, this person could be a doctor and help people, and this person can be like a world famous swimmer. Why is it that you need people to almost like qualify? Like you want to know that they're going to bring some kind of benefit to society, rather than just focusing on the fact that these are people that need safety.
Exactly. It feels very transactional, but also that it's very, how do you say that? It's insensitive in the way it presents it. I don't remember the name of the website, but I could swear I've seen once in like a headline that was saying that we could solve a lot of, like, I think, medical personnel shortage by taking in young refugees who could eventually study medicine. It was really funny because I also get that myself. A lot of people say, but we're okay with you because you're like, you work and you study. And I think, well, that supposed to make me feel better? Like, because it's not. So I don't know what you're pointing at. It's very frustrating.
Can I say something? I think, to me, this whole thing stems from really like the dehumanization of like Arab Muslims, or like people of Arab descent generally, but mostly Muslims, I think, because they have been, it's been a process that's been going on for centuries, this framing of Muslims as the barbarians, the enemy, the non-human. And because when you think about it, that discourse wasn't really present when it came to Ukrainian refugees, right? We never really questioned, like, oh, what kind of value are they going to bring us? People only cared about bringing them to safety, and rightly so. That's what you should be doing. And I think the reason why the media is so insensitive to Palestinians' plight is because of this as well. 100%. Like, this is something I've really come to see as fact now. The way that we've dehumanized Arab/Muslim lives, and I know they're not all Muslims, but these are populations which are considered largely Muslim, and the Muslim is the enemy of the West, and it's not worthy of being saved. And if anything, we, the West would even tend to encourage crushing these populations.
I am very conscious of the time, so I want to talk about one final thing. Ilham, you mentioned it earlier, and I referenced it too, how there are some authors that have written some books about Palestine. They're telling Palestinian stories. They themselves are Palestinian. But when we dig a little bit deeper, we find out that their attitude or their views on Syria, which they are also quite public about, or maybe not, are actually really harmful. This has come up a few times, I think, in the literature world, but I still think doesn't get enough attention. And I think you guys know mainly who I'm talking about, but I'm sure there are many others as well. Ilham, I want to hand over to you. Like, what do you make of that? What do you think are some of the things that we should be asking ourselves? And feel free to use this platform if you feel comfortable to name some of the authors that we should be a little bit more wary of.
Yes, so I think people are so feel so helpless, and they feel so desperate to be able to talk about Palestine and to help the cause and to inform people, that we will compromise on some of our morals or beliefs, or sometimes it's not even compromising on your beliefs. Sometimes you can just align with different beliefs. That's whatever. I think we're so desperate to help and to be able to recommend books about Palestine that we either overlook some writers activity online, or what they actually write, or their actual beliefs that you can actually see very transparently in the books. So we're talking here about Suzanne Abu Hawa. She's a Palestinian writer who is very very prolific, very popular. Her writing is gorgeous. Her stories are very, very touching, very, very moving. I first read her books back during the 2021 war on Gaza. I first started with her novel Against the Loveless World, and I was reading it, and I really, really, really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed reading it, but while I was reading it, I had this hunch that some of the things I was reading did not align with my views, especially views about dictatorship. And you could see very clearly that there is very explicit praise of dictators, notably Saddam Hussein. And then a bit further down, you see stuff about Gaddafi, and then I think maybe even stuff about Syria at some point. And all praising dictatorship and demonizing things like, the imperialist intervention of the US and things like that. So I was reading it. I had a hunch. I felt a bit odd about it. I spoke to close people of mine about it. I spoke to some bookstagrammers about it privately, and I raised the issue, and they all pretty much said, oh no, I didn't really notice this. I think it's just a symbolic thing. I don't think this is a thing. So I just brushed it under the mat. I completely ignored it, and I posted my review of the book, which was a very glowing review. And then sometime later, I actually brought it up with Ola, and I said to her, listen, there's something that's been bothering me. What do you think about this and this and this? And then she was like, oh, okay, let me do my own research, let me check. And then we both started to do, we went down a rabbit hole of researching this author, and we weren't sure. And then we kind of got confirmation. And now I want to pass the mic to Ella, because I think she will be much more eloquent and able to talk about this in a much better way. So mic to you, Ella.
Yeah, thank you, Ilham. And I know how, honestly, it's not easy to realize that one of your favorite authors not only does not support your cause, but actually actively takes, because it's different. It's different when an author does not support your cause and never speaks anything about it, and when someone is active on spaces like Twitter, or even writes articles for news outlets like Al Jazeera, of all places, to whitewash dictatorships. I join also. I have not the same, but a bit of a similar. I have some kind of experience that resembles Ilham. I was a huge fan of Suzanne Abu Hawa. I admit, because I liked her writing, I overlooked some of her narratives, but not only the ones relating to Saddam, because I thought that one. I think I also told Ilham, I thought maybe that was brought up to show that
It's
this
flawed.
character
Yeah.
has this flaw, that
Yeah.
she was exactly, she was not flawless. She was Saddam sympathizer because of his anti-Israel, a very strong anti-Israel, anti-USA stance. Um, but then also in a lot of her writing, there's a lot of dehumanization of the Palestinian, just to kind of get the reader's empathy, and you can feel it. And that's not something that I have myself noticed, but also other bookstagrammers who have more of an academic literature background. I actually have a degree in literature. Back in the I used to be I used to be a literature graduate back in the day. Then I shifted to data science and artificial intelligence. But a lot of people that actually have a much better literature education than I had pointed out the same issues with her writing. But later on, also the very soft, I would say, whitewashing of Assad regime. So it's not that like Susan, like you would never find anything about Susan Abu Hawa saying I am an
Mm-hmm.
Assadist or I am pro Assad. I don't think
No,
anyone
it's
is
very
stupid
insidious.
enough to do that. Not exactly, not someone as a as a much of a public figure as Susan Abu Hawa is. But it's more that, writing an article pinning the chemical
Oh yeah.
massacres on Israel instead of on Assad. Not and I Even after the investigation of the OPCW, I believe, when it turned out that the Syrian army there was clue that there was evidence, sorry, that the Syrian army was behind the chemical massacres in Douma. There is still anything to be said by Susan Abu Hawa about the fact that she denied that he had any role in this. Even if it was an opinion piece, I think this is a huge step when it comes to seeking accountability. And these victims, some of them survived and they're still living with us. And the fact that you don't even feel that you're obliged to say anything, I think that in itself speaks volumes. But also stories of her harassing Syrian activists online, also saying like horrible things about all revolutions of the Arab Spring, but like
Mm-hmm.
also about Libya and how it was, as we've
Wow.
heard it all. It's all like a conspiracy.
Yeah.
It's all a CIA, I don't know what kind of conspiracy. Um, retweeting, um, retweeting news, fake news, basically about the white helmets, who are the only civil defense respondents on the ground in the liberated areas. So retweeting conspiracy about how they are, yeah, one time it's Al
Oh
Qaeda, the other time it's CIA, the other time they
yeah.
are abducting children. I would like to mention a very famous person I unfollowed for when I saw him retweeting these things. It was Khalid Abu Najah, and I always followed him because I liked his anti-Sisi, like
Yeah.
very anti-Sisi, anti-dictatorship stance, support for Egyptian activists and detainees. But then when I saw him retweeting stuff about like basically conspiracy theories about the white helmets, I was, yeah, and that was during the days of the earthquake. So they were the only ones responding on the ground and helping people that are actually our families from under the rubbles. These conspiracies were being spread by people I have deemed allies. Um, so yeah, it's a very, yeah, it's a, yeah, I don't know. I hate to say that it's nuanced, because to me it's very simple. You either oppose all oppression or you don't. That's
Yeah.
it. And it's not, there is no, like, when we say none of us is free until all of us are free, we have to understand that also includes, when we say everyone, we mean everyone. We don't mean everyone in the Gaza Strip. you know I wrote something that I was planning to say today, but I
Mm.
don't know, it might seem a bit,
Yeah, I
I'm
know
just
what
gonna
you're
say
talking
it, and,
about.
and yeah, we talked
Mm.
about this earlier, Ilham, is that if this is one is for content creators, and I don't know if they're listening. I hope some content creators would be listening to this one, but just don't be a sellout. I guess I get it that for some people this is their
Yeah.
livelihood. I get it that this is their main source of income, but being a content creator and being able to make these things and to make this content and reach out to these authors, that probably means that you're in a safe place and
Yeah.
you're in a very privileged position, and you're able to
Mm.
opt in and out of causes and like selectively support some cause and not support the other. But the people who live in Palestine and the people who live in Syria, they do not have this privilege, and they do not have, their lives sometimes are at stakes. I think we have very, very recently heard how Israel is going after journalists who were documenting the situation that started unfolding earlier last weekend. And they want to target these journalists, and they've already, I think, killed 10 journalists so far. These people that are bringing you the truth, they're putting their actual lives at stake. So I think, even if your livelihood is at stake at some point, there must be a better way to make things up than being a sellout. And I'm sorry that I'm using this word, but that's honestly the only way that I can see it.
And Ola, I really sympathize, and I really share your final sentiments about not being a sellout. And I know that for some people, like, it is a big decision to make, but I don't think it's a bigger choice when it comes to life or death of the Syrian people, or ending apartheid and colonialism in the Middle East. Like, it really saddens me that so many people are taking a stance that is not on the right side of history and is not on the right side of justice, which is why I really wanted to kind of create a space where we talk about understanding a little bit more, so that we're always making the right decision and that we never forget. But it has been so wonderful speaking to you both today on the show. Thank you so much for your time. I will put all of the books and authors mentioned in the show notes for people to find. And I will also be sharing the social media handles of both Ola and Ilham. Highly recommend that you get in touch. And I have to say, like, both Ola and Ilham are so generous with their time in the work that they do to promote the right kind of literature. But especially, I think Ola has done so much work in getting the right narratives around Syria, especially out. And Ilham, you do so much. So thank you so much for today and for everything.
Thank you, Samia, for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me as well. Thank you.